Weekly Wisdom. My name is Natalia Eileen. I lead Scene at Work. We're a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm that supports organizations of all sizes and industries with their diversity, equity, and inclusion needs. Every Wednesday, I like to hop on here at 9 a.m. Eastern to share with you some tips and tricks and just something to motivate and encourage you to continue to put diversity, equity, and inclusion at the forefront of all the work that you do and to give you some resources to do that well. So, today, I'd like to speak to you specifically about how we can better support women of color in your organization. Now, this is a topic that is really important for us to always think about, particularly the different subsets across our organization, especially as diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders. I'm hearing a little bit of a siren outside. Apologies if you can hear that as well. Now, when we think about women of color within an organization, that's women who are not white. So women who are Black, who are Indigenous, who are Latinx or Hispanic, those who are Asian or a Pacific Islander. We want to be thinking about how important it is for us to think about our organization from the different subsets that exist. Now, you might be wondering, Natalia, why are we focusing in on women of color? Why should I be thinking about 3 ways to specifically support them? Well, I always like to point out that there are resources out there that indicate how important it is for us to be thinking about our workforce this way. Specifically, there is a great resource that comes out every October from McKinsey and Company, a management consulting firm that's known for partnering with Lean In to create and distribute this report, Women in the Workplace. This is last year's article, and it's very much worth downloading and reading if you haven't already. But every October, I do take a moment to sit down and read the updated version of this report, which comes out annually, and to learn more about what McKinsey is seeing in its research around women. And this is all women, but what they do is they also break down their research into subsections of that population. And this is where we can look at the intersectionality of a woman's experience within a workplace. And that's when we do realize that there are differences in the experiences that women have based on their race or ethnicity. There are also uh, interesting insights that come about when looking at women who identify as LGBTQ+. But because of these things, we want to make sure that we're taking the time to not just enhance the experience of women around our workplaces, but also that we're taking the time to enhance the experience of women of color in particular, since we know that there are even more pressures and even more adverse experiences within that population. So, again, why do we want to think about this? Well, just to enhance your thinking around this topic, I did pull out 3 stats from that McKinsey in the Workplace report with Lean In. And these stats do pertain specifically to Black employees or Black women employees. However, the point is that we can see that there are reasons why we need to be emphasizing BIPOC women in these spaces. So, the first stat here is that white men have 3 times and white women have 2 times the access to senior leadership than Black women, according to the research that has been done in the past by McKinsey and Company and Lean In. Only 19% of Black women report access to mentorship or sponsorship opportunities, which we know can be really important to helping women and everyone ascend across an organization toward the top, compared to 27% for white women and 31% for white men. And then also, we know that only a quarter of Black women state that their manager has supported them in navigating workplace politics, compared to 39% and 41% for white women and men, respectively. And this is where we know that the dynamics related to race and ethnicity, particularly in the United States, but also around the world, play a role in how people experience work. So it's not just gender, but when we think about that intersectionality, we also have to think about the compounding effects of being someone who has multiple identities that have been historically marginalized in this society. And that's why we're going to focus on women of color in particular. So this Weekly Wisdom is all about the 3 ways you can support women of color in your workplace. Let's start with the first one. And of course, this is a non exhaustive list because there are so many different things you should do, but these are just 3 things you should consider doing if you're not doing them already. The first is to be intentional about how your data reflects employee experiences, how they're segmented, and how they're analyzed. Have you been looking at your employee data based off of this subsect? Many times, organizations will think about their employee data, whether it's their employee experience data, retention data, hiring data, in terms of race and ethnicity, and then in terms of gender. But it's not always the case that organizations are looking at the connection or the intersection between the two. And this is something that is encouraged so that you can see how your organization is influencing the experience of women of color in particular. Now, that's just the first tip. If you haven't been doing that, strongly recommend you look into analyzing your data a little differently. The next thing you can do, leadership support to BIPOC women, which could include developing sponsorship and mentorship opportunities. Since we know that women of color, and in that statistic that I shared with you, Black women in particular, have less access to mentors and sponsors in most workplaces, we can use this as an opportunity to uh, insert an intervention that has equity in mind. So, when we think about equity in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we want to be thinking about which groups have not had access in previous years or generations within workplaces. Which groups do we need to do maybe a little something extra to make sure that they're getting the same access as other groups within our organization? And in this case, it might be a good idea to create a sponsorship or mentorship opportunity that is specific to your BIPOC women, specific to women who are not white. And that can be something that you can do in order to make sure that everyone within your organization is getting access to mentors and sponsors. Okay. And then the last thing I'm going to suggest for you is that you amplify the voices of women of color to help your employees see themselves as leaders and culture makers within your organization. This is an intentional practice. If you've had events and opportunities where you have panelists, internal leaders sitting on panels, or where you've had uh, speakers of different kinds within your organization speak on behalf of the organization or share an update, take an inventory of how reflective that panel or those speakers have been of your organization's diversity, and potentially be a little intentional about amplifying the voices of women and particularly of women of color, because that amplification can go a long way to ensuring that everyone sees that they exist and that they're here to stay. And it can also help those women themselves see themselves as leaders and culture makers within the organization who are supported by your organizational culture. All right. So, as we always do, I'm going to quickly run through the 3 different things you can do to amplify or better support women of color in your organization. And these are just 3, but hopefully you're doing a whole lot more. If you haven't been thinking about these, though, consider it because it can be really useful for you to implement these 3 and start seeing some changes and impacts in your culture. Starting with, be intentional about uh, how data is analyzed and segmented. You can also provide leadership support to BIPOC women by offering opportunities for sponsorship and mentorship. And then you can amplify the voices of women of color to help your employees see themselves as leaders and culture makers within their organization. As always, we have tons of resources on the C Network website. And I do want to highlight one resource that you might be able to check out on your free time. This is an article that we released last year about retaining women of color. And this can potentially give you some additional ideas as to how you can continue to keep this topic front and center. In addition to that, I also want to highlight that we have a bunch of resources at C Network that hopefully you consider otherwise. So those resources include our newsletter, our socials, and specifically, I want to make sure that I get you a list of all of that. You can find us on Twitter, you can find us on Instagram, you can find us on YouTube, and you can find us on LinkedIn. Here are the different handles that you can find us at. And also, if you do want to speak to one of us on the team about your specific organizational challenges as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, you can do so at cnetwork.com/consultation. And with that, it's been a little over 10 minutes, so I'm going to sign off and I will see you next Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.